Today's video lesson deals with the concept of biodiversity and how actions that put the Earth's species at risk are threatening to cause a biodiversity crisis on our planet. First of all, what is biodiversity? We know bio means life, and diversity just means variety. So when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about the variety of life in an ecosystem. When we talk about biodiversity, we also refer to species richness. And that's just the number of different species present in an area. So if you have high species richness in an ecosystem, you then have high biodiversity. And it's important for the long-term health of ecosystems to have high biodiversity because this increased variety of life in an area leads to a more sustainable ecosystem, which means that that ecosystem will be stable over the long term. In general, if we look at areas closer to the equator, these areas have higher species richness and thus greater biodiversity than areas farther away from the equator. Tropical rainforests, for instance, have the highest biodiversity of any ecosystem on the planet. Across the globe, we see biodiversity hotspots, and these are just areas that have an exceptionally large number of species in a relatively small area of land. In Canada, we are fortunate. We have several biodiversity hotspots. We are even more fortunate because one of them is right in our own backyard in southern Ontario. The Carolinian forest, a deciduous forest in southern Ontario, makes up only about 1% of Canada's total land mass, but has a higher number of species than any other ecosystem in Canada. Point Pelee National Park protects the Carolinian forest in our area, and if we visit there, we can see the higher species richness in that area. There are also biodiversity hotspots in the Litrim wetlands near Ottawa and in the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve. If we think about biodiversity and make a simple comparison, if we look at the Amazon rainforest, there are over 200 species of hummingbird living there. By contrast, Ontario only has one species of hummingbird in the entire province. So if you look at species richness and biodiversity, you can see how much greater how much greater biodiversity, how much greater species richness there is in the rainforest compared to areas like Ontario that are farther from the equator. Ecologists are concerned that the Earth's biodiversity is being threatened. And of course, the biggest threat to biodiversity is the influence of human activity. When we look at threats to biodiversity, we're especially concerned about species at risk. And the main reason that the species around the globe are at risk is because there are growing threats to their habitat. And habitat loss in general is one of the big reasons why species are endangered. When we look at habitat loss, we are looking at practices such as deforestation, that's removing trees. And every time we remove trees to make room for a human population or to harvest resources for the pulp and paper industry or for the lumber industry, we are removing habitats. And that's putting species at risk. They don't have nesting sites, they don't have protection from predators, they don't have sources of food. So that habitat loss is having a big effect on species health. Urban expansion to make room for cities is also fragmenting or destroying habitats. The other thing with urban expansion is that we're putting up big skyscrapers, and that is confusing for a lot of bird species who end up being killed because they fly into windows of skyscrapers. Agricultural expansion, increased farming practices to feed the 7 billion people that are on our planet are also destroying habitats and fragmenting habitats as well. Pollution as a result of industrial processes, climate change due to increasing carbon dioxide concentrations are also leading to health issues for many of the species on the planet. When we look at species at risk, there are several levels of risk, and on your handout there's a chart that you want to fill out with a definition of each level of risk, and we'll go through some examples of each as well. The highest level of risk is extinction. That means the species has died out and no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Extirpated is the next level of risk, and that just means that a species that used to populate an area no longer exists there. If a species is endangered, that means that they are facing imminent extirpation or extinction. The conditions in their habitat have gotten so harmful to them that they face these higher levels of risk. If a species is threatened, it means that ecologists think that they are likely to become endangered if the current conditions in their habitat don't change. So these are being monitored very closely to see if their situation changes or worsens. If a species is a species of special concern, that's the lowest level of risk. But ecologists are concerned that existing conditions are fragile and may lead to those species becoming threatened or endangered in the future if things don't improve for them. Now, you should know that species on these different levels of risks their assignment can change depending on the condition of their habitat. If there's improvements to the habitat, they can be removed from the list. If their habitats worsen, they can move up in terms of levels of risk. Just a note about extinction. Extinction itself is a natural process. It would occur whether humans are present on the planet or not. And there have in fact been 5 major extinction events in the Earth's history. The concern is that human activity is drastically increasing the extinction rates far above the normal natural extinction rate that we would expect. And in fact, current extinction rates due to human activity are about 100 to 1,000 times greater than what would be expected if humans were not involved. And ecologists are concerned that this increase in extinction rate may lead to a biodiversity crisis in the future. We want to take a look at these various levels of risk in species that are present in Canada. And the data we're going to look at comes from an agency that keeps track of species at risk in our country, and it's from data they accumulated in May 2013. First, we want to look at species that were once present in Canada but which are now extinct, which again means that they are no longer present anywhere on the planet. And the first species we're going to look at is the passenger pigeon. This bird was once so abundant that you could see flocks numbering in the thousands or more flying overhead. It was in fact one of the most abundant birds in North America. It was hunted out of existence. There was also disruption in its nesting grounds, and there was virtually no effort at the time to save them. The last passenger pigeon in the wild was shot and killed by a boy out hunting in 1900, and the last one to die in captivity was in a zoo in Cincinnati in 1914. The passenger pigeon situation was actually a catalyst for improved conservation efforts for species in North America. Some groups, in fact, are even looking at trying to reintroduce the passenger pigeon through genetic manipulation techniques. Great auk is another extinct species. It was a flightless bird that lived in the North Atlantic, and the causes of its extinction were mainly overpredation by polar bears, hunting by humans for their down feathers, which were used for pillows. And as they became more rare, the eggs of the auk became a luxury that European collectors wanted in their possession. So collecting the eggs also led to further decreases in their population. They became extinct in the 1800s. The sea mink is another species that is now extinct. It was semi-aquatic. It lived in Atlantic Canada, and it was again hunted to extinction for the fur. And those went extinct between 1860 and 1870. There are 22 extirpated species in Canada as of 2013. One of those is the paddlefish. It's been gone for 70 years from the Great Lakes, mainly because of loss of spawning areas. As well, dam construction has interfered with their habitats, and industrial pollution has led to poor health. Also, overharvesting by the fishing industry led to the removal of this species from our area. The Atlantic population of the gray whale is also extirpated, and that's mainly due to habitat changes caused by human industrial activity and exposure to toxic substances in the water, as well as some subsistence whaling that was done in the Inuit and Aboriginal populations. There are 298 endangered species in Canada as of May 2013, and one of those is the whooping crane. The risks faced by the whooping crane deal mainly with their wintering habitats. They face habitat contamination by oil and gas spills and heavy boat traffic in the areas where they overwinter. And that's leading to decreases in their number that has put them on the endangered species list. As well, the wolverine, its numbers have decreased greatly in the eastern population, mainly due to hunting and trapping, as well as decreases in their food sources and loss of habitat as well. There are 164 threatened species in Canada. Among those is the killer whale. They've been experiencing low reproductive rates and chemical contamination of their habitats due to human activity in the area. They also succumb to collisions with boats, and the acidic waters are also affecting their ability to find prey as they use echolocation to find their prey, and that is affected by the acidity in the water and makes them unable to locate their prey as effectively. The wood bison is also threatened. Ecologists are watching this population. They're finding that bacterial and insect-borne diseases are causing loss in numbers there. And there's also habitat loss due to human development and agricultural practices as well that are impacting the health of that population. And they're also seeing some drowning that's affecting the numbers of the wood bison. There are also a number of species of special concern in Canada, 192 as of May 2013, and among them is the polar bear. And the biggest threat to the polar bear and the biggest concern to the polar bear population is the impact of climate change. Climate change is causing a melting of the ice cap areas of Canada, and that is affecting the polar bear habitat as well as their hunting grounds. They hunt on the ice and they live on the ice, and the loss of that ice is really having an effect on their populations. There's also environmental contamination and human-bear conflicts that are putting their numbers at risk. The short-eared owl is another one of special concern. They're facing habitat loss and impacts on their nesting sites. They're also seeing a decrease in the prey population and increased collisions with vehicles that are causing losses to their population. So all of these animals are under the watch of a government agency that assesses species at risk. And if things don't change in their habitats, then again, they could face higher levels of risk as they move forward. In Canada, there are several agencies that care about species at risk. The big one is COSAWIC. It's the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. That agency monitors the status of species at risk across the country, and they keep a registry of species at risk called the SARA registry, and you can look online and monitor various species across the country and see what their levels of risk are. There's also an agency called RENEW, the Recovery of Nationally Endangered Wildlife, and this agency prepares action plans for endangered or threatened species and lobbies for changes to their habitat to increase their protection. And that's the lesson on biodiversity and species at risk. Please complete the questions on your worksheet, and we will discuss it in class tomorrow.